Hello there. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, thank you so much for stopping by. If you remember my last quilting video that I did about my coworker who is about to have her first baby girl, that video got over 3,000 views so far, and I am in awe. I've only been making YouTube videos for about a month. I'm beyond a novice when it comes to this stuff. And the fact that there were that many people that wanted to watch a hobby of mine is just amazing to me. So if you stopped by, thank you. If you want to check it out, here's the link up here. And with that, let's talk about binding a quilt. So after we've made it, your quilt is not complete until you've bound it, okay? And it can be super intimidating and scary, and I'm going to show you how to not be so afraid of it. I'm going to show you the step-by-step process. I'm going to show you how you can use your leftover scraps from the Scrappy quilt to be able to make it into a proper binding. Okay? This is a fun, scrappy thing. You don't have to do anything fancy. You don't have to buy any special equipment or anything like that. And if it's not perfect, it's okay. After I finish this project, procrastination much, I finished, washed, and dried it today to give to her today. So, oops. But after I did that, I saw all of my flaws. I saw everything that wasn't perfect, and I really kind of felt bad about it. And I gave it to her anyway because I didn't have enough time to get to the store to find something for her. She loved it. She absolutely loved it. She was inspired and just in awe of this quilt that I made by hand, and she was beyond impressed that it was made by hand and all of that. So yeah, don't let the imperfections that you see prevent you from sharing in a hobby that you're just going to get better back with in time. So with that, let's start talking about how to bind a quilt. So first things first, I want to use any leftover scraps that I have from when I made the original quilt, as well as I have some leftover quilts from my previous project. So everything needs to be cut down to 2.5 inches. And what I'm going to do is once everything's cut to the proper length, then we're going to sew it together, and I'll show you how to do it, to create one single piece. So that when we actually do the bind, it's going to have all of these different colors on it, just to kind of pull in around the quilt using the fabrics we have. Now, on the quilt, if you remember, I did do multiple fabric types. I have snuggle fleece, I have minky, and I have this kind of jersey fabric. For the bind, I am just going to use that snuggle fleece because it will shrink down when I wash it, and that's what I want to have happen, if that makes sense. So, I have these pieces right here, and then I'm going to make sure that they are 2.5 inches long, and then I have the fabric that I actually used for the quilt to kind of use in between. So, and I'll have some be longer and some be shorter than the others. And so while I do this, I want to just kind of show you, if you're really new at this, these cutting mats can be pretty intimidating on how to read them and how to use them. So on this board right here, this is my cutter ruler. So each of these is 0.2. So if I go here and I cut on this second line, depending on how you can see it, that's where my half is. So whenever I'm cutting fabric, so the biggest thing you have to remember when you are lining up fabric on here is we want to be able to use that 90-degree angle as much as possible, especially if you're a beginner. So as I'm lining this up, I have it squared up on this bottom line, which is on the 10-inch, as well as on this. And on this part, it doesn't matter what this is. I'm just using this as basically a cutting mat so that you can see what I'm doing. And then for here, I'm going to go to this solid line on the bottom, and each one of these full squares is 1 inch. So I know that I have 1, 2, and then I'm going to that second line on my square for my 2.5. And I make sure that that's lined up with the bottom being along there and the top, or the side rather, being in that middle piece. And that's how you make sure that you have a squared cut. Making sure that you don't move. So a lot of people will put like stickies on or something like that. And always making sure that you're cutting away from you. Never cut towards. And I love using the Scrappy variety of quilts just because I can get away with using a lot smaller amount of fabric for a lot more projects. Like this is the last of the fabric I have that was for this. This was my first ever baby blanket actually for my niece that I did. And it turned out super cute, but I only got a 1/4 yard because I liked it, but it was going to be kind of in that scrappy. So I can save my stuff for when there's a sale and whatnot and get kind of a lot of whatever fabric's on sale to be able to use as filler. And then the others, it's okay because I usually only end up getting about a 1/4 yard. So I have another coworker who is having a baby here in a couple months, and I'll be doing another baby blanket with her. And hers is interesting because she chose not to do a gender reveal, and that's going to be interesting because finding colors that worked within a theme was a little more challenging for me. I like bolder colors. So, and this one isn't straight on that side, so I'm just going to turn. This is why I like having my stuff straight to begin with, but because I made mistakes on my squares that I did for the initial quilt, I'm trying to reuse them any way I can so that I just don't have as much waste. So I have all of my leftover strips cut, and because we're going to be turning this into binding, you're not just going to be losing the typical 1/4 inch that you do whenever you're quilting. So I know that this is not going to be enough to do the entire circumference of this quilt. So I am going to have to cut into some of my leftover bulk fabric, and then I will probably cut it down, you know, choose 3, 4, 6 to maybe 18-inch strips just to kind of break up the block and make it look a little bit more patchy on the binding. And because my coworker that we're doing this blanket for is actually a laboratory scientist, I'm going to use probably a lot more of this fabric just because I think I love the theme and it has all of those different colors that are in the quilt in all of these different features in here. So I think that will actually help bind everything together. So I will be using more of this color. And I didn't really go over this in my first video, but whenever you are cutting from a lot of fabric, so like this is yardage, you always do your finished ends together. So even if this were, you know, a 1/4 yard and it made more sense to visually to fold it this way, you never want to do that because I know that these are the finished ends and I know that this is straight. So that helps me when it comes to squaring things up because I don't like to take a lot of time on my squaring. It's just kind of a hack that I use. And because I'm not going to be cutting for the full square here, it's super important, again, to make sure that this fold on the bottom is lined up along here. And then I'm going to trim just to this 12-inch mark to make sure that I have a solid square when I cut my 2.5-inch strip for the actual quilt. So then we're going to go 1, and at this point I am actually using the measurement of this cutting board. So there's my 1-inch, 2-inch, and here's my 2.5 mark. Always make sure that you're familiar with your lines on your cutting board, or your cutting mat rather, so that you know where your, honestly the 1/2-inch one is probably going to be the most important, but also your other measurements. As you get further along and more advanced, you'll need those different spots. Okay, so I'm at the sewing machine, and this is where we start combining our binding. And this is where I always confuse myself. Because what we are wanting to do, excuse me, is we're going to go in a 45-degree angle. And I struggle to remember how I want this to fold. So before I do this, what I typically will do is I get it lined up. So you're going to make a T and then kind of simulate that 45-degree angle of where that sew is going to be right here. And this is what we end up with. And this will create a continuous line as we go down, the more that we add. And then once we've added that, we'll trim our excess. So, and what you can do, some people have like an actual template that they use, but what I honestly do is I just make a little crease where I've done that 45-degree so that I know that I follow that crease on my sewing machine. Let me show you what I mean. So I've got my two fabrics on my sewing machine, and I can see the outline of my line right here, and that needs to be where my straight line is. So as I drop my foot, I'm going to be right there. I've got this lined up and centered, and I'm just going to follow that line. Well, it would help for following that line if my thread was actually on my machine. We are thriving tonight. Okay. Well, now we're going to do it. Okay, I'm going to cut it. So when I cut those two pieces off, they will lay exactly like that. So let me show you what I mean here. Maybe. Provided I can find my scissors. Okay. And so then it lays like this, and I've got a little slippage right there, but that's not the end of the world, because what we do now is once everything is combined, okay, so typically we do this when everything is combined. I just want to show you guys here. When we do the iron and we fold it, this is how it's going to look. And it can be a little bit forgiving because when you are binding this onto something, the edges, so right here, this actually is going to be along the quilt. So, and then what happens is we're actually going to fold it over and over. So you've got this part and this part's clean. So we're good. Okay. So I'm going to get these all going, and then I will show you what I mean when we actually get it all.